Welcome back. I will start to talk while the last people are finding their seats. So we are moving into discussion about urban knowledge. And of course, the first question would be, what are we talking about here? What is urban knowledge? And following on that, where do we find urban knowledge? And whose knowledge counts? Who possesses the knowledge that we have found, and for whom is this knowledge produced? So this session will examine how to re-articulate these questions through innovating in organization of different knowledges that exist within cities. And I'm happy to introduce to you our chair, Professor Stephen Gaya Agong, who is the director of the Kisumu local interaction platform and also the Vice-chancellor of Jaramogi Odinga University of Science and Technology in Kisumu. Stephen is a horticulturalist and a leader with over 30 years of university teaching, research, and community outreach. He has initiated and supervised projects at community level towards socioeconomic development and livelihood improvement. He has a long experience in research and policy with exposure to national, regional, and international research programs. So welcome to the stage, and you have with you Tim May, Tapio, Salonen, and Mark Atherton.
Thank you so much, Henrietta, for that powerful introduction. Good morning, everyone. We are gathered this morning to witness a discussion on urban knowledge. And indeed, urban knowledge probably describes the most important reason why we are here today. Everything that we have discussed from yesterday through today oscillates around urban knowledge. But who is the bearer of this urban knowledge? Who is the user of this urban knowledge? Who is the applier of this urban knowledge? And it brings me to an important question that relates to two individuals who are represented in this particular conference, namely a man and a woman. And as it is said and written, that if you want an interaction between a man and a woman, try to find out how their brain operates. And you will find that the man's brain are usually small boxes. One box may be dealing with cars, another one may be dealing with housing, another one may be dealing with money. But they are separate and there's no linkage in between or across. Yet, on the other hand, the woman's brain operates such that it is like a super internet highway with the fabric interwoven across everything, and indeed they can multitask. Why is this important? In an urban setting, if you do not have the blend of the two, you are bound to miss the point. Yet, you require the brain mechanism of the two to be able to operate and sustain. Ladies and gentlemen, when we talk about urban knowledge, it is so important to discern or distinguish, probably uniquely and not discriminately, where are we talking about it? And here, the center represents an important area when we are talking about urban knowledge. Yet, the concern may be very uniquely different, depending on who is talking about it, depending on who is hearing it, and depending on who would like to use that urban knowledge. And sometimes we wonder as to why it is so difficult to have a point of convergence that would describe exactly why Kisumu should be growing or developing in a certain way, or Manchester is growing in a certain different way. At some point, you may find that probably it is the economic that is the driving force in terms of what we think about in the urban setting. Yet in other circumstances, it could just be the standards. We want to maintain very high standards. If it is water, it is pure water that we are talking about. How is it produced? Where is it produced? Who is producing it? What is the affordability? And yet, we have the universities which sometimes are very inclined towards processes. And here we are talking about the spin unit. And the spin unit seemed to afford me or accord me the most important description of what could be happening in the urban setting, namely the systems, the processes, the innovations, the networks, and probably who is using it, novelty, integration, and ultimately the transformation. This morning we are blessed to have a team of 3 panelists that are going to help us dissect through this topic of urban knowledge. We have none other than Professor Tim May, who was introduced to you yesterday. Tim has been a professor of many years, and I have read his books, quite sociological in nature, yet I'm from the other part of the world, horticulturalist. And we come to a point where knowledge has brought us together. Then we have none other than Mark Atherton from Greater Manchester Carbon Hub. And indeed, this Carbon Hub, it will be probably exposing us to some knowledge that in terms of reducing the carbon footprint, we need to partner with such creative, innovative knowledge as well. Last but not least, we have Professor Tapio. Professor Tapio is the Dean, Faculty of Health and Society at Malmö University. Of our latest baby in the LIP category called Skåne LIP, and we are happy to have him. Ladies and gentlemen, we would want to use the next few minutes just to appreciate, understand, and distinguish, even hereafter, what is it that we would pick as carry points home in terms of urban knowledge. And I want to welcome Tapio to get us off with this discussion. Welcome.
Thank you. My presentation will evolve about our experience of a commission that we launched in Malmö, the so-called Social Sustainability Commission in Malmö. We have already talked a lot about the need of neutral spaces where research, other actors could meet, and then this Malmö Commission is, I think, is one very clear example of this. Our society has been increasingly being caught in a transformation that has seen its city change in terms of globalization, migration, and urbanization. And in a multicultural city as Malmö, with the sharp contrast between rich and poor, native and outsider, spatially between supposedly vulnerable and prosperous districts, questions about social cohesion and sustainable urban development come to a head. The Malmö Commission recommendations has therefore been urgently to initiate a social investment policy, which is based on a social investment perspective and, among other things, includes social investment funds corresponding to major infrastructure investments. And as I see it, the debate on sustainable development implies a distinct shift in perspective, how growth and development are viewed. It has been increasingly clear that it is people's own health and well-being must be in the focus of the development that we need from this point of view, and especially if we are now going into the concept of a just city. So in contrast to the dominance of a neoliberal urban policy and planning of recent decades, as many already have been touched upon. Feinstein, in her book Just City, she identifies 3 criteria that I think is very crucial for us about equity, diversity, and democracy. Her analysis emphasizes both substantive and procedural justice, the what and the how of a just city, if you will. This broadly agrees with the Malmö Commission's 2 general recommendations. The first, to establish a social investment policy that can reduce inequities in living condition and make societal systems more equitable. And the second, the how, change processes by creating knowledge alliances and democratize managements. This, demonstrates the need for a more social dynamic analysis of the social transformations of the city that managed to capture both its exogenous and endogenous dimension. The former by viewing the city in its relevant context, the latter by contributing a proper understanding of the relations and, as you wish, tensions between different city districts, between different population groups, and so on. These both internal and external aspects are intertwined in the social fabric of the city. Instead of concentrating on some single specific aspect of social development, as it mainly are customary, Malmö Commission's plea is more to offer a more consistent analysis of a broad range of demographic, social, economic dynamics in the city. And this concerns questions like reduce segregation between residential areas, improve trust, safety, and social opportunities, contribute to deliberate location of schools in good environments, contribute to a sustainable, mixed, inclusive city, contribute to a new economic and strategic structures, and last but not least, make use of people's own experiences and knowledge. So the aims of combating both substantive and procedural injustice is also the overall message from the Malmö Commission. But that is yet to be seen how far these ambitions will be realized in practice. Thank you.
Well, I'd like to start with something that Deborah was saying yesterday about Zen and the art of motorcycle maintenance. I am a motorcyclist, and I was also an engineer. And when I was an engineer, the only way in which we conceived of knowledge was knowledge that was actually a help us to A, fix something, or B, improve its efficiency. And this notion of knowledge being very mechanical in this way exists with us still today. It is extremely seductive, and it relieves people of the uncertainty and ambiguity that comes with the fact that knowledge cannot exhaust things. There is always a surplus to it. Now, also I've heard, and I have heard in my 9 years of involvement with Mistra Urban Futures, all these things about theory and practice flying around. I'm a practitioner, I'm a theorist, and all those sort of things. And what I see, of course, is a great deal of identity work on the part of people who wish to present a particular image of themselves in one way or another. And we attach our identities in these ways, and our knowledge is also bound up with our identities. And this is a considerable challenge to the idea of admitting of ignorance. But thinking about theory and practice, let me put it to you like this. Theory aims at the production of thoughts that accord with reality, whilst practice aims at the production of realities that accord with thought. They are on the same coin, they just flip around. We seek clarification in all sorts of ways for the things that we do. And we have, since the time of Plato, been trapped into the idea that knowledge leads to certainty. It is the absence of ambivalence. It is the absence of ambiguity. It is the quest for certainty. We can see that in technological advances. We believe very often that there are certain problems to which people will present solutions. And sometimes we make advances. But how was it that scientific knowledge could be conceived of something that was a solution to a problem without raising any further problems? What magical thinking exists within us all to believe that scientific knowledge can do that and relieves us of that burden? The other thing also is that people talk about theory in a way, sometimes that it's abstract and therefore not concrete. Notice that we're playing with dichotomies in the way that we think about this all the time. But at this present moment in time, we are being governed by the most extraordinary abstractions of how we are as people. Yesterday it was said, what about agency? Well, to conceive of agency in this way, that when I leave my home, I go to consume something. When I do so, I've subjected myself to a rational process of deliberation that when I enter into purchasing something, I've done so to maximize my individual preferences. That is a bizarre, weird, abstract way of conceiving of me, and it is the fundamental principle of neoliberalism. It is the thing that we are living with all the time. So when people say to me that is abstract, I say, well, look at reality. That's pretty abstract. Shiny office blocks, full of potential, full of promise, and every piece of knowledge has that promise attached to it. So when we start to conceive of co-production, as Merritt was saying yesterday, as this space is a very, very uncomfortable place to be. Furthermore, it is also a space in which there are extraordinary parallels that exist between universities and governments and business. I've worked in business, for business, and every single organization is siloed in a particular way. This presupposes, of course, the maximization of efficiency according to framing worldviews in certain ways. Universities do that. They're siloed into disciplines. It allows them to be organized, it allows individuals to have particular identities, and it allows the organization itself to be subject to controls around cost center budgeting and accountability. Yet, we are constantly and continuously told that the world needs something that's more interdisciplinary in order to succeed. We need to get out of our comfort zones. We need to admit of our ignorance. And we have attempted to do this on a number of occasions with government agencies. So, on one particular occasion, this is the practice bit, on one particular occasion, the Government Office of the North West of England wanted to enter into a process which was from information to intelligence. We are all overwhelmed with information, but intelligence is another matter. But a number of years ago, I remember Stephen saying to me, Tim, that isn't the problem we have, we need the information. And that was an immediate halt to my idea that, of course, that was a presupposition on my part I should not have made. But the notion of intelligence is not knowledge. Intelligence is the ability to take knowledge into practice in context. And the other thing that we deal with all the time is this peculiar relationship between content and context. In other words, that when a piece of policy comes cascading down to some officials to try and make sense in a context, somebody has had the conception of that policy. And the division of labor is between the conception of that policy and the execution of it in context. But the execution in context is entirely secondary to the prerogatives of the people who wrote the content, because their will to power over a given terrain is the thing that you will challenge if you try to bring content and context together. Now, these are fundamental problems of the world. They're not problems of books and things like that, although they can become problems of those. Beth and I are writing books on reflexivity and cities and knowledge at the same time at the moment, and my mind is just being completely unpicked by this. Because I see the instrumentalism of knowledge. I see knowledge being framed and used in particular ways around a set of values, and those values are very narrow. I see the exclusion that knowledge performs of a whole other sets of values that matter to people by taking the single value of economic transaction as being paramount. Who ever conceived of a world in which economic behavior could ever be separated from the cultural and the social? It is bizarre, it is extraordinary, and this is what we're living within at the moment. So we can change these things, we can do that within the context of co-production, and I can say a little bit more later on about how we attempted to do that, sometimes effectively and sometimes not so. Thank you.
Okay, good morning, everybody. My name's Mark Atherton. I work for the 10 local authorities that make up Greater Manchester. So I am the epitome of a bureaucrat. I am the epitome of a civil servant. And all of the people that you've been lambasting over the last 24 hours, I am they. I'll try and prove that a little bit different, hopefully. The diagram before you is the Greater Manchester Low Carbon Hub. I need to tell you a little bit about how this came about, because the context is important. In Greater Manchester, we are at the forefront in the UK of seeing devolution of power from nation to city region. And it's devolution of power in many different guises. Devolution of the ability to make policies which currently are held by nation state. Devolution of some funding, particularly around social care, healthcare, but also in transport. And with this devolution comes great responsibility, and it does mean that we need to increasingly base our decisions on good evidence, good knowledge, good intelligence. So, in the first devolution deal, which actually was back in 2011, one of the things we agreed to do was set up a low-carbon hub. The first thing to say is, for me, it is a misnomer. It's not really all about low carbon. I would call it an environmental sustainability hub. But even by that, I would acknowledge that it almost totally excludes the social. I would also say that the Greater Manchester strategy, which is our overarching strategy, whilst it professes to be around sustainability, it was based on the conduction of a piece of research which was called the Manchester Independent Economic Review. It was almost totally about economic potential of the city. And this is characterizing Greater Manchester, and it has done for many, many decades. And many cities are the same. I think Stephen said earlier, it's about the economy stupid. However, it's therefore surprising that even though the evidence base that was used was primarily economic, the strategy that was produced in the end arguably had good elements of social and indeed environmental sustainability built within it. The Low Carbon Hub isn't really a governance structure. It is intended to be an engagement mechanism. It is intended to say local authorities cannot achieve the complexity of carbon reduction that affects all of our major urban conurbations alone. They need to work with the public sector, the private sector, the voluntary sector, and indeed academia to make that happen. And what role does knowledge play within this? I'm reminded of a quote from JFK. He wasn't talking about sustainability, but I think it's still apt. He said, "The world's problems will not be solved by cynics and skeptics whose vision is limited to the realities of what is. We need people who can dare to dream of things that never were." And for me, that's why the Low Carbon Hub was created. We can argue about how successful it's been, but that's why it was created. It was to try to get people to dare to dream of things that never were, to help us to solve some of the problems, in this particular case about climate change and carbon reduction. Just to explain the diagram for a second. So the inner petals here are the resources that are availability. The local authorities, Chamber of Commerce, universities are the key partners, and it's overseen by a Low Carbon Hub board, which is a mix of public, private, voluntary sector, and academia. We set up discussion groups, thematic groups, on each of the major areas that affect carbon reduction. Again, you will notice there is very little social within there. It is environmental and economic. And we aim to also engage with national government. This was another part of the city deal. We set up memorandum of understanding with 2 national government departments, Department of Energy and Climate Change, as was, and Department of Environment. And these were moderately successful. We looked at what national government could do, we looked at what we could do, and we looked at what we could do together, and the MOU was framed around what we could do together. With the support of Mistra Urban Futures, we looked particularly at 3 things: our governance, our policies, and our evidence base, or our knowledge. And we found that there was, through a baseline assessment, there were gaps in each of those. I can talk more about governance and policy later on, but today is about knowledge, or this session is about knowledge, and I want to talk about that. We found that most of the KPIs, the key priority indicators that the city was set itself to achieve, were largely economic. There were some social, there were very few environmental. So we had no way of raising up to our leadership whether we were achieving or failing in terms of our sustainability as a city. We found that the people that we were engaging with as part of this process were not evenly spread. There was an equality imbalance, particularly around ethnic minorities, but that's true across Greater Manchester structures as a whole. But we also found that only 7% of the people that we were engaging with were from the voluntary sector. And we thought, well, this is actually wrong. This is a very top-down approach, and there is very little understanding of the bottom-up. So again, under the Mistra Urban Futures programme, we set about to try and redress some of this and do some work with Beth and Tim and others to work with and learn from some of the community work that they were undertaking. We also looked at the amount of research that we had available to us. So when we're creating policy, what are we basing our evidence on? And what we found was that the evidence base was incomplete. There was some evidence from universities and from higher education, which was around climate change adaptation, a lot of work around climate change adaptation, largely because that's where the funding was at the time. But very little university research was being utilised, environmental university research was being utilised in policy making and decision making. And why? We have 3 great universities in Manchester. So we came up with the idea of, well, let's look at this and let's do a little bit of thinking around how we can change it. And this simplistic diagram was the way I was thinking at the time. You put the right people in the room, you talk to local government people, universities, companies, communities, and you get them to open up their ideas, and you maybe apply a little bit of money, and out comes fantastic solutions, fantastic proposals. Sadly, it didn't quite work that way. We talked to our community groups, or rather those organisations that represent community groups, because at Greater Manchester scale, it's 2.7 million people. And there's great interaction between the local authority and their communities. But when you talk at Greater Manchester scale, there is a gap between the politicians, if you will, and the communities that they serve. And so we talked to organisations. We said, well, we want you to share your knowledge with us. We want to address some of these bottom-up issues as well as top-down. And the response we got was, well, do you know, we've had lots of cuts, and we don't really have the resource to engage with you. And when we've engaged with you before, not me personally, but whether we engaged the state before, you've listened and then you've really done nothing about it. And I think from hearing previous people speak, I think this perhaps is repeated elsewhere. We talked to the universities, and they said, well, we'd love to engage with you. And they came along to 3 different meetings, and they stuck with it. But after the 3rd meeting, we were still talking about the terms of reference and what we were actually going to do. And it became clear that actually that probably wasn't the right way forward either. And when we talked to the private sector, they were very concerned about intellectual property and who would own the rights to whatever research came out of it. So this model, sadly, doesn't work in that simplistic way. But what it does show is an opportunity to be able to think about how we work differently together. Some things have worked as a result of this interaction. We've set up a platform, a website platform, which has allowed different voices to be heard, so that it's not just what the state is doing, but it's also what other people are doing across Greater Manchester. And by bringing some of those real examples of what's happening in communities or what's happening in different organisations, we hope to create a greater picture of what's happening in Greater Manchester and to create an imperative for carbon reduction. We have put together a better evidence base now. It's still not perfect, and we can still improve it. But at least I'm reasonably sure that the pathways that we're starting to create at least are based on some form of more cohesive evidence than before. I have a lot more to say, but I think I'm out of time. Thank you.
So, ladies and gentlemen, we are back to the same question. What is urban knowledge? As we rethink about this topic, I want just to get the participants here not getting more confused about urban knowledge, but probably if there is anything they would ever remember, maybe just one thing about urban knowledge. And I want to plead with the panelists that let us, maybe in a sentence or a word, tell us exactly what this urban knowledge is all about.
Thanks for the question. Instead of posing urban knowledge, I would put in forefront knowledge processes. I think we are staring blind of the first stages of knowledge, when traditionally researchers do some studies and so on. I think when it comes to link this to the whole endeavor of just cities, we are talking of very long-term knowledge processes. And I think the experience from the Malmö Commission was that it's first when studies, the materials are penetrated in a multi-dimensional way, when you have policymakers and you have the concerned citizens involved, then we could have processes when the knowledge are used in different ways.
Tim, maybe you could give some indication in terms of the work that has gone through, especially Mistra urban features as a center. Where would you position Mistra urban features in terms of filling this gap of urban knowledge?
Well, I think the original intention behind the call from Mistra in the first place, which we were involved with, was to bring elements of knowledge together that didn't normally come together. And that was about an inclusive social process and the social organization of a center to achieve that. And I think what's interesting about knowledge in this sense is that knowledge still hovers outside of practices and perceptions and identities in particular ways, and it's a difficult thing to do. The key to Mistra Urban Futures was always going to be the innovation of the social organization of its knowledge production. And the question, therefore, that immediately arises is, would you put it in an institution? In the first instance, which sees knowledge production in a particular way, there's an immediate agonism in that, and a tension in it, that if we are going to innovate, and I mean innovate in the sense of not, lots of forgetting that normally happens and no memory, and then everybody can come along in a couple of years' time and say, hey, I've got an innovation, and history's been eradicated, which is normally what people call innovation. I mean in the sense of a different organization, a different way of doing things, which actually places almost everyone that is part of it in a very uncomfortable position. But that discomfort cannot be something that's individualized, it must be something that's collectively worked on. Because ultimately, if we are trying to do something different, that means it's going to feel uncomfortable. And the varying levels of comfort that we may have about particular knowledge, I mean, I might write books, but I don't confuse clarification with resolution. And a lot of people do that with knowledge. They confuse those two things. They're not the same. The resolution comes in practices, but there's also a reflexivity about practices to make sure you're doing the right kind of things according to sets of values. And it's the inclusivity of those values and those different ones that I think is the most important thing. We are being governed by a very particular set of values at the moment, which have been manufactured quite clearly through a series of lobbying with politicians and others to create a particular view of society through the economy and a very particular idea of the economy. We have to attack that and we have to undermine it if we're going to move forward.
Thank you so much. Mark, could you just give us some indication on whom you describe as the most important person or an individual that would be the most important carrier of urban knowledge in an urban setting?
I'm not sure that's possible. For those Star Trek fans out there, I tend to believe that if there's one thing, then it's a hive mind. We need to create knowledge which is understood by the many, not the few. And in fact, to say, is there one person who it is important that they have this knowledge, I'm not sure anybody really has the brain that's big, maybe Tim. But maybe don't have the brain big enough to sort of hold all of that. And not just hold it, but make sense of it. And as you said, Tim, it's about intelligence. So I don't think it can be one person. I think personally that if you create a hive mind, as I would describe it, then actually that has many different benefits. My employers will listen to me because they see that I have facts and figures. But importantly, they will listen to the electorate, because they're politicians.
So you would subscribe to the theory that indeed urban knowledge would be a much more important ingredient in the co-production as a tool or as a method than anything else.
I think co-production is useful in that it provides a space to allow people to reflect and to take account of other people's worldview, because different people will have different views of exactly the same topic, even the same fact.
Right, ladies and gentlemen, I want to open the floor so that we get some quick response or a question. I can see a hand over there. There are two hands.
Well, I just would like to comment on the last question, who would carry the urban knowledge, and I would suggest, well, the merchant. I mean, we are talking about business. Tim is referring to the economy. And what is a city really, basically, historically? It's a meeting place for business. I mean, it's the business that has created cities. And during these 2 days, I think we have been talking surprisingly very little about the role of the economy and the business, which in fact has so much of the power and defines so very much about all these issues, the justice, the social development, the power, and so on, in the city and the city development. I think we need to address that aspect a little more.
Thank you. We had another hand over there.
Thank you. It's Zarina Patel. I have two questions. The first one is for Mark. In talking about the low carbon hub, you started off almost apologetically about the fact that the social wasn't there. And when I look at the diagram, questions of skills, buildings, transport, I don't understand how those are not issues that are social. So I wonder, energy, etc. So I wonder whether you could maybe also just reflect a little bit about what do you think would be different if the social were there more deliberately? How would that have emerged differently? So I think there's some reflection on that. Yeah. Then the next question, I'm suddenly feeling very confused about the differences or similarities or spectrum around questions of co-production and participation. And I hear the issues around the importance of co-production being about bringing people in, appreciating different viewpoints, reflexivity, etc. But I heard all of those things last century when we spoke about participation. And I wonder whether then, for the panel to reflect on whether participation and co-production sit on a spectrum, is one a subset of the other? How do they relate to one another? Do they happen at different times? Are there different purposes? Are there different players that are involved? So some reflection on the differences or similarities between the two. Thank you.
Right. Ladies and gentlemen, let's hear from our panelists. We have had two very important comments, and one is even a question. Would you like to start?
Sure. I'm also a little bit confused about all the talk about co-production, as it would mean that all the actors should be as the same. I think it's very crucial that the researcher stays as a researcher and the policymakers have specific role and the concerned citizens have their roles. I think it should be seen as an open arena where the possibilities is that knowledge could make a difference, but that shouldn't mean that we as a researchers should be policymakers. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
So I'll answer your question. I think part of the work we undertook as part of Mistra Urban Futures was to look at the governance structure. And it became clear fairly early on that within Greater Manchester, if you talk about sustainable urban development, which was our starting point, you had a structure which allowed a conversation between the economic and the environmental, and the economic and the social. And actually, the interaction between the environmental and the social was much weaker. That's not to say it doesn't exist. So you're quite right. Under buildings and energy, we undertake work around fuel poverty. We do undertake some work under sustainable consumption and production about food. But what we fail to do still in this structure is truly grasp the trilemma of sustainable urban development. And so we still need to negotiate with colleagues about, is it food for carbon reduction, or is it food for obesity, or is it food for food poverty? What are the issues? And that debate still hasn't happened. So I guess what I'm reflecting is that this is still, in my view, an imperfect structure. It's just what we're living with.
We had a question about business and cities. I think this rather neatly brings us straight into the knowledge economy. And the concept of the knowledge economy and what that is, in other words, essentially gaining competitive advantage by virtue of having particular assets that reside in knowledge that are seen to be better than other places. And this leads to a kind of competitive spirit between cities as to who's at the forefront of the best knowledge economy. We can see that in Manchester, we can see it in other places. And we can see how it is that those particular cities are configuring themselves in the names of being the best places to attract business for that purpose. Yet, of course, that is a selective framing of actually what happens within a city itself. But it also accords something to business as a kind of homogeneous entity. Let's be clear, we're talking about transnational companies, multinational companies, small and medium business enterprises as well, some of which are actually within cities themselves, identify very strongly with those cities, and actually offer services and products for the purposes of those people who live in those cities. So we need a more nuanced understanding of what we mean by business. The other thing is, of course, in terms of the knowledge constructions of what happens within business, that one can say that sometimes, like 40% of activities that actually happen on a daily basis within those organizations have nothing whatsoever to do with profit maximization. So there's a kind of surplus way in which we frame business in a particular ways, because those too are social and cultural places, and those people who work in them normally actually reside in those cities too. So what is the proper relationship that doesn't produce this kind of silo mentality, say, between business and the social and cultural? And you can see how businesses themselves are divided up into particular ways for the purposes of efficiency, which they then sell those services to customers as being the best things they want. And Marx once famously said, beware that the model of reality doesn't become the reality of the model. And I've seen many businesses try to sell an image and a promise and a possibility to people, and they sell them to cities too for that purpose. What do KPMG do, if not that? The best practice seminars where at the end of the day you have to go into the bar later on to hear about the actual reality rather than what you've been told on the stage that you should emulate. So there's a lot of things to say about what our expectations are here. Back to co-production and participation, absolutely. Its appropriateness and expectation, its positionality and its power and its responsibility. You do not pass problems on to people who do not have the power to take them forward. For me, that's the fundamental difference between co-production and participation. And if co-production becomes a method where there's an expectation of participation in constituting a problem, but then the realization of its solution, in an inappropriate way those people aren't positioned to have power, then you're using science and forgetting politics. That's not appropriate. So we have to be exceptionally sensitive about this. Right. And I think yesterday as well, that Merit was saying this is not a panacea. But once again, there's this overwhelming desire to see the new method. I mean, I sit in a Sheffield Methods Institute, and somebody says to me, great new multi-level model got here, you know, these are the solutions, and I go, no thanks. We've had enough of the technicism, enough of the method. It's more nuanced than that. It's not to denigrate what people do, but it's bounded, and it's bounded spaces. We need bounded spaces in order to act in the first place, in order to have agency. But at the same time, we have to recognize the limitations of those. And the honesty that is necessary to realize those is differentially positioned. And much of the things I do in academia, I do because I'm positioned as a professor, and it doesn't have the same consequence for me. But I would not position anybody lower down in the hierarchy to do that work if it was detrimental to their career, unless I could find a way of doing it in the cracks that institutions have. And I've found quite a few cracks in institutions.
Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, our time is up. And I want to indicate that it has been a very difficult topic to discuss urban knowledge, as you have heard. It could be indigenous knowledge that we are talking about, but you have heard that inherent intellectual capability or capacity is not necessarily knowledge. It could be information that you have gathered that is not necessarily knowledge, and it could be something else. We would have a chance this afternoon, when we are in our various groups, to review this discussion further. But for the time being, I want to thank the three panelists. I've learned that it is very difficult to control colleague professors. And it's part of the knowledge acquisition that we have gathered today. But let's put our hands together for these panelists.